Hello, and thank you for joining us on the New Mexico Suncast. I'm Jim Williams. I'm joined by Joaquin Romero. He is our producer, and he's also the Community Relations Director for the New Mexico Sun. Our special guests today are Fred Nathan with Think New Mexico and Paul Gessing with the Rio Grande Foundation. And our topic today is bringing back healthcare workers to New Mexico. Fred and Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to see both of you. Let me tell everybody about your organizations a little bit. Fred Nathan Jr. is the founder of Think New Mexico and its executive director. He serves on the boards of the Santa Fe Preparatory School and the Thornburg Foundation. He's a former trustee of his alma mater, Williams College. Paul Gessing is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Their mission is to promote liberty and prosperity for all New Mexicans by educating citizens on the importance of individual freedom, limited government, and economic opportunity. Um, I wanted to interview you both together because I know, one, that you don't agree on all these issues, but I also know that in the midst of disagreeing, you have a lot of common ground and you're both willing to talk to one another. And the best thing about both of you is that when somebody in another party has a better idea, you both will acknowledge that is a great idea. And I just think New Mexico needs to get back to working together despite our differences. We just have to. Fred, I think you've told a story about um, working in New Mexico government and leadership, putting people with all kinds of different views in a room and saying, "You're not leaving until this is done." And I think we have to get back to that. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's what they did with workers' comp. And people forget this because it was so long ago, is in the mid 1980s. And when the last worker comp insurance company left the state, the then Governor Carruthers took all the stakeholders, put them in a room, and said, "Work this out. And if you don't, I'll draft my own bill, and none of you will like it." And that was enough motivation to get business and labor to work together. And they came up with a bill that the legislature ratified, and it served the state well for the next 4 decades. And we could do
Well,
the same thing with medical malpractice.
yeah. And Paul, before we start talking about healthcare in New Mexico and bringing back healthcare workers, could you give us a little history? This is real more of a national history about how healthcare came into being and health insurance, et cetera.
Yeah, at the national level, of course, healthcare has been a hot button issue for many, many years, decades. And you have to draw the line somewhere. So I'm going to, as is so often the case in American history, really highlight World War II as setting in motion a lot of forces that are impacting us, not just here in New Mexico, but across the country. Of course, during World War II, there was a massive mobilization to win the war. And one of the things that were done by the Roosevelt administration was wage and price controls. They didn't want the limited labor force that was available at the time to be competing against each other and raising wages to the point where businesses, companies involved in the war effort couldn't afford to hire them, or they didn't want labor unrest and strikes. So uh, wage and price controls existed, but businesses being creative, they started to come up with workarounds. One of those workarounds involved providing fringe benefits. One of those fringe benefits is healthcare. And so that was one way that businesses were able to, you could call it skirt, you could call it flout, you could call it whatever, but that they were able to attract and keep workers by providing fringe benefits like healthcare and health insurance. Really, in 1954, the Internal Revenue Code was passed, uh, and it specifically exempted employer-sponsored healthcare plans from income taxes. That is really one of the gigantic factors that affects American healthcare today. Personally, and I'm happy to discuss this, I think it was a bad idea. I don't think they saw through the situation at the time, but that's just the way things went. So then you got Medicare and Medicaid. Now, Medicare is wholly paid for through the federal government. The FICA tax that you see if you get a paper statement on your payroll, FICA, a big part of that is Medicare. That is for the elderly. Uh, then you have Medicaid, which is ostensibly for the poor, poor Americans. It's a joint federal state program, and Medicaid is going to be a significant part of the conversation we have about health policy. It's been a hot button topic in healthcare discussions in New Mexico. Uh, Medicaid is, depending on the state's poverty level, paid for by some level of federal and some level of state. In New Mexico, it's about 70% federal, 30% state money. And that's driven because we do have a high poverty rate. So in most other states, it's much more evenly split. And that's for the poor, but there are programs for the elderly as well, especially in the area of long term care, which is, of course, end of life care. So uh, then you fast forward briefly, there was an attempt at a more nationalized healthcare system under Bill Clinton, of course, his wife Hillary. Uh, that became Hillary Care. Won't get into the specifics of that because it ultimately died. Then you had a big expansion of Medicare. So again, the elderly program, when George W. Bush in Congress enhanced that to include a drug benefit. So prescription drugs were now included under the Medicare system, paid for under that program. And then the last major tinkering with the healthcare system occurred under President Obama. That became known as Obamacare. If we had Hillary Care, we've got Obamacare, and whoever changes the system next will probably have something named after them as well. Uh, that's a complicated piece of legislation that we're living under today. Among the bigger things that were done is that it expanded Medicaid to include some number of uh, working poor, able bodied poor, not just the truly indigent as originally under Medicaid. And the restrictions were imposed on insurance companies and pre existing conditions. So you could have a health problem that was going to drive up costs, but the insurance companies could not pay for that in a insurance way. Insurers, of course, have actuaries, and if you're a smoker, they'll charge you more. If you're dealing with a heart murmur, they'll charge you more. The smokers, they could still charge more under Obamacare, but not the heart murmur or some other healthcare problem that was inevitably going to drive up costs. So uh, the Medicaid expansion was also, of course, tremendously impactful as well. And the federal government picked up the tab for that initially, and then that was gradually dropped to, I believe, 90% is the federal match for Obamacare specific uh, additions to the Medicaid program. So that is a very thumbnail sketch of where we stand today in America, and it impacts everything here in New Mexico in some very profound ways that we can discuss.
Well, Paul, everything you just described really applies to all 50 states. It applies to all Americans. Was that true?
That is true. Medicaid being a unique example here in New Mexico, where because of our heavy Medicaid population, it is more impactful here.
So let me switch now to Fred. Fred, and I'll remind our viewers, he is the executive director and the founder of Think New Mexico. Of course, Paul with the Rio Grande Foundation. Fred, I don't like when New Mexico, I love New Mexico. I've talked to you in the past. You love New Mexico. You're here because you love New Mexico. I know Joaquin loves it. He's built a house and has a family up near Santa Fe. Paul Gessing, he's spent a lot of time in Washington and other places. He loves New Mexico. But when I find out things like New Mexico's the only place, the only state in the country that has lost doctors since 2019, that's really alarming to me, Fred. Why are healthcare workers leaving our state?
It's a variety of factors, and in our research, we spent 2 years researching a report on how to solve New Mexico's healthcare worker shortage, and I think it comes down to, well, we have a shortage of every category. It's not just doctors, it's nurses, it's physician assistants, it's dentists, it's physical therapists. EMTs might be our worst. As I think I told you in a previous broadcast, we're about 4,900 short.
Wow.
Um, and it comes down to three things. And I'll just start with the doctors. It's our medical malpractice premiums are about double our neighboring states. It should be the lowest. Um, and that's because the system that we've built up over time is so unbalanced in favor of trial lawyers at the expense of healthcare providers and patients. So that's the primary reason, and I hear this everywhere. Second is our Medicaid reimbursement rates, despite the best efforts by our legislature to raise them, are very low. And doctors and other healthcare providers will tell you that when they treat Medicaid patients, which make up about 42% of our patient population, they're losing money on nearly every procedure. So that's a problem. And Paul and I have a respectful disagreement about how to solve that. And then the third thing that I know we agree on is that New Mexico is one of only two states that taxes medical services. And the other state is Hawaii. Hawaii caps it at less than 5%. I can't remember now if it's 4.3 or 4.7. New Mexico, it's the full gross receipts tax. And in many parts of the state, that's 8%, other parts, it's 7%. And as a doctor recently pointed out to me, not only do providers pay it, that's the first thing I should say. It's not on the patients because the federal government, which pays Medicaid and Medicare, won't pay state taxes. And insurance companies, because of their size, are able to negotiate contracts with providers where they say, but we're not paying state tax. So this is a tax that providers have to eat. And so that's one of the reasons it makes it so difficult to recruit doctors here is if you're a rational economic actor, and this is well known, New Mexico and Hawaii are the only states where you'll have to pay the sales tax or what we call a gross receipts tax. So you're starting out about 8% behind. And as I was mentioned earlier, a doctor mentioned to me, it's not just the gross receipts tax. You have to have somebody on staff who's there to help you collect the tax, to deal with tax and revenue on all the various idiosyncrasies. So it's more like 10%.
Mm.
So high medical malpractice insurance rates, low Medicaid reimbursement rates, and a tax on medical services. And it's like a three-part whammy. And that's why we're the only state between 2019 and 2024 to have lost doctors, 248, which is about 6 or 7% of our doctor workforce. But that overlooks the fact that it's going to get worse because if you go to the medical review board, which licenses all our doctors, you can find the age of every doctor.
Mm.
About 39% of our doctors are 60 and over. So this
Wow.
problem is going to get worse before it gets better if our elected officials don't act soon.
So you're
I would
really,
agree, uh, Jim and Fred, with all of those broad points. I would only add one additional, and this arose from a conversation with a doctor that was in the legislature, and he said, "Doctors are people too," and he said, "You've got issues in New Mexico that affect everybody, but also affect doctors and crime, the education system. I mean, especially if you're a doctor, you're a highly educated professional who spent a lot of time achieving those goals. And you look at New Mexico's education system, especially the public schools, and you say, well, uh, that's not going to get the job done, basically. And we all know that there's ways to uh, deal with that. You can, of course, get a private school or whatever, but it's a factor, and those are two significant additional factors, I think, in this whole conversation. But directly in terms of the medical shortage, the three that pertain to it directly, I'm in lockstep with Fred, at least in terms of analyzing the problem.
Well, I still want to lay a little bit more groundwork before we get into the specifics that Fred and Paul have just talked about. So, Paul, I'm going to go to you. I think we ought to lay, both of you, I think, would agree. Do doctors and lawyers, I've just added that, do they both have a right to have successful businesses and make a profit to take care of their families?
I'm not a
I
big
know.
fan of the term right, but you certainly have a right to pursue those things in your respective field. And yeah, it's something that uh, we should be in New Mexico, in the United States, encouraging people to pursue fields of study and field professional activities that are, in a free market economy, going to lead to a high level of remuneration. We obviously value doctors and the time and education and the services they provide. And as, quite frankly, our society becomes wealthier and more prosperous, it is natural to an extent. People criticize the amount of spending that we engage in with regard to healthcare, but when you've covered your food, your housing, etc., the next frontier is leading a longer and better life, and so people are willing to pay for that. So it is natural that we have some level of additional spending in the healthcare field. But I think it's also obvious that not just at the national level, but here in the state of New Mexico, we are not exactly achieving that goal, certainly not very effectively.
Paul, what's happened in recent years? I don't know, 5, 10 years in the New Mexico legislature to change healthcare leading to this crisis that you've both described?
Well, I do want to emphasize that the Rio Grande Foundation has also done policy research on this. We've written about various topics relating to healthcare and the medical provider shortage and broader healthcare issues in general. And it's all intertwined. It's kind of like pulling on a ball of string. You get a lot of changes if you shift the policies in a better direction. But I believe 2021, when the legislature and the governor enacted a bill that dramatically increased the caps on medical malpractice insurance, that was a huge turning point in driving this issue. Now, to their credit, the governor and the legislature took action on that one specific part of that medical malpractice issue as it pertained to certain medical practices. And then, after a lot of debate and a lot of bills being killed in 2023, finally everybody got in a room together and said, we need to at least stop the bleeding in this particular area. And so we saw a more reasonable cap, and I think it's $750,000 is where they went, but they indexed it to inflation. So it was, and that was per instance of medical malpractice. So there's potentially other litigation issues. Creative attorneys can always find ways to drive a massive hole through this type of legislation, but they did kind of address that issue in 2023. But that is one of the more recent major health policy debates that's happened. We obviously have not solved fully the medical provider shortage or the medical malpractice issue. The gross receipts tax goes back to World War II, but as time has gone on and the rates have gone up, that has impacted negatively the ability to draw and maintain medical providers. And I would say that many states that haven't had, say Massachusetts or a state on the East Coast versus New Mexico, this isn't a policy decision, but if you go to medical school in Massachusetts, you grow up there, you start your practice there, you may see the growth of a state like New Mexico or state like more like Arizona where it's really fast growing. You're not likely to pick up and move your practice to a brand new state, even though the population is double or tripled in a state like Arizona. So uh, there are medical provider shortages in other states, predominantly a lot of those faster growing states where you're just trying to keep up with the recruitment of the medical professionals. So, but from a policy perspective, purely driven by the legislature, I would say the medical malpractice back and forth that we've seen starting in 21 with some reforms made in 23, but continuing to be an issue as we sit here in 2025. That is a policy issue that remains critical.
Yeah. I want to encourage Joaquin to jump in here. Joaquin and I interviewed you, Fred, at the Roundhouse about midway through the last legislative session, and it was right before a pack of bills addressing the three major points that you've brought up today. You had your team put together policies, and you were able to have one of those pass, which is um, Senate Bill 88, which provided a trust fund for Medicaid reimbursement rates. But before we talk about that specifically, and that's really going to finish our interview today talking about that bill and what you accomplished. The main reason we wanted to do that is because that wasn't what Paul wanted to do. And the legislature passed what you wanted to do. What I love about it is there's a synergy between you two. That you guys are still talking about things. You want the best for New Mexico, and so this is the way things go. But Fred, I want to first talk to you about there's some opposition to what you have proposed to the legislature in all of these areas. Who is opposing these policies?
Actually, there's really just one group. They happen to be very powerful, and that's the trial lawyers. They opposed our medical malpractice reforms, and they opposed these interstate healthcare worker compacts that most states have joined. There's about 10 of them. New Mexico's only in one. We're one of only 5 states that's in one or fewer. And the sticking point is that all of these compacts have a section that says we're governed by a board of governors and they're immune from liability for acts in their official capacities. And you would never sue these people. So if there's a medical malpractice in Hobbs, you're not going to sue the commissioner from Rhode Island.
Mm.
But to the trial lawyers, I'm trying to be fair here. And full disclosure, I'm a fourth generation lawyer. I'm actually a recovering lawyer. I haven't practiced in 26 years, but I have a high regard and I've worked closely with many lawyers over the years. I have nothing against lawyers, but in my view, they're wrong about the compacts. This is the single most important thing our elected officials can do to alleviate all of these shortages in the near term, and that is to join these compacts and make it easier uh, to recruit healthcare providers. But the trial lawyers don't like the fact that it prohibits them from suing a very small and narrow class of people, like I said earlier, that you would never sue. So they're the only ones opposed. In fact, on the Doctors Compact, which 43 states have now joined, and DC and Guam, uh, they opposed that, even though we had groups like Planned Parenthood and the Catholic Church, who have never worked together on any legislation, agreeing we should join the Doctors Compact because they both have a shared concern that their healthcare clinics aren't able to attract enough staff to stay open. And the only people that stood up against it were the trial lawyers. And
Well,
same thing with medical malpractice.
let's go ahead and talk about, okay, you've made policy recommendations in the past legislative session. Part of the reason we're doing this interview and a series of interviews is we want voters to understand that the legislature can take action and solve these problems. It's not that complicated, but we have to get some consensus. And there's some things. I'm a retired banker. My perspective is that the lawyers are doing things to benefit their business, to make it more profitable, and I don't disagree with that. The problem is you have to have a balance. You can't gouge people in real estate lending, for example. There have been times when people would charge exorbitant rates, interest rates, and things, and take advantage of people, and that's just not appropriate. It's just not.
Hmm.
So I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying that I think if we have lost 300 doctors, we've lost a percentage of procedures that are performed in the state. And to me, that's lost opportunity for lawyers, I think, because there's always going to be a percentage of mistakes. Is that right?
Yeah, and we're all in favor, and at a fundamental level, our malpractice system should be about making patients whole. And I don't even believe that our current medical malpractice system does that. So, for example, on attorney's fees, progressive states like California, Massachusetts, New York all cap attorney's fees. We have no statutory cap on attorney's fees in New Mexico. So that means when a patient who's been harmed by medical malpractice hires an attorney, they may not understand uh, that a large part of whatever's recovered is going to go to that attorney. And that's why these progressive states like California, New York, Massachusetts have capped them. In the last session, our bill would have capped attorneys' fees at 25% if the case is settled, and at 33% if it goes to trial, because that involves more work. And the point there is that every additional percent that goes to the lawyer is a one less percent for the patient towards the goal of making them whole from their injuries. And even that was opposed. And as I said earlier, progressive states all across the country have capped attorneys' fees, but we haven't done that. That's just one issue. Another issue is punitive damages. We have the lowest standard for proving punitive damages in the country and no cap on punitive damages. And we proposed in our bill, I thought something that's very sensible that would reduce the incidence of medical malpractice, which is, and here I have to back up, there's two kinds of damages that patients harmed by medical malpractice receive. One is compensatory, which is designed to make them whole for their injuries. And then the second is punitive. Punitive damages are only supposed to be awarded in the most egregious cases where there's been gross misconduct. But in New Mexico, because the standard of proof is so low, they're routinely alleged. And doctors tell us that in many cases, well, I shouldn't say it, in some cases where it's frivolous, doctors are inclined to settle because they don't want to roll the dice on a jury awarding punitive damages, and then they've lost everything they've earned over a lifetime, and so they settle. And so that's just wrong too. So we said, look, where there's punitive damages, let's take 75%. So that's not money that's used to compensate the patient. That's compensatory damages. With punitive damages, let's take 75% of that and create a patient safety fund that can be used to address areas where the medical system is weak. Maybe that's training for doctors in a particular hospital. Maybe that's reducing the patient doctor ratio in another area. And we know where these medical malpractices are occurring. There are patterns, and we can address that and bring down the incidence using some of this punitive damages. And sometimes these cases are so large, like the New Male Medical case in Albuquerque just this year. I'm told it is the largest state court punitive damages awarded in the history of the country, $412 million for an erectile dysfunction case gone wrong. And I don't doubt that the patient suffered and should be compensated. But punitive damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars really doesn't do anything to prevent future medical malpractice cases. And we could use these resources and keep them in the healthcare system to protect other New Mexicans from medical malpractice.
Jim, I just want to jump in real
Please.
quick and fill in some of the gaps in what people may not understand about what Fred is saying here. First and foremost, we have occupational licensing laws. If you're going to be a doctor, if you're going to practice in a variety of fields, not just medical, you have to get a permission from the state government that is regulated at the state level. That is what Fred is referring to in terms of the compacts, and states can agree that if you live in and practice and you're licensed in New Hampshire or Florida, and he alluded to it, I just want to make sure to put that as a fine point. The trial attorney issue transcends their opposition to the compacts. They, as he mentioned, the new mail and other issues, they come to New Mexico and they know that they can get big payouts in the state. So they are a nefarious force in many ways in this debate. So I'm not disagreeing with anything on that. But another way that the legislature can, and in some cases has, acted is by expanding scope of practice laws within the realm of safety. And in fact, many New Mexicans don't see a MD, they see an NP, a nurse practitioner, when they go for a basic checkup. And that is actually something that New Mexico does pretty well. We have over the years, in certain ways, expanded scope of practice in a reasonable way to make it easier for people to serve folks around the state. An issue that we worked on several years ago, a decade ago, involved dental therapists and their ability to practice and provide dental treatments in rural parts of New Mexico. There was a big debate over a nurse anesthetist and nurse anesthesiologist. And believe it or not, that was a hot button issue in the legislature for years. So New Mexico can do more, I'm sure, on occupational licensing in some of these professional areas while keeping patients safe. We're actually, you're going to be shocked because normally I am critical of virtually everything that happens in Santa Fe, but New Mexico in a lot of these areas has actually done pretty well in expanding scope of practice. But obviously, as Fred's saying, as we're having this conversation, there remain a tremendous number of issues in terms of serving the population of the state and the medical sphere. So I just wanted to kind of provide some of that, the filler for what Fred is saying in a big picture way there. And all of it, I believe, in what Fred is saying is 100% accurate.
Well, kind of the final points of our interview today are going to be surrounded around Senate Bill 88. There's good news for 42% of people in New Mexico. They are currently on Medicaid. And Fred, if you wouldn't mind explaining that doctors don't typically like to take Medicaid patients because when they perform a procedure, Medicaid reimburses them at a considerably less rate than they would normally charge. What have you done to help that problem?
So that's Senate Bill 88, and this is an area where I think Paul and I agree with about analyzing the problem. We disagree on the solution. We proposed, well, let me go back and give some foundation for your listeners. So, about 50 years ago, a handful of legislators at 30,000 feet looked at New Mexico and said, we're very reliant on natural resources, and we ought to do something for when those resources are depleted. So they created something called the Severance Tax Permanent Fund. And it began with $7 million with an M. Today, it's $9.7 billion with a B. And that generates about $500 million a year that goes into the general fund and is spent on things like education. If these legislators hadn't done this 50 years ago, we'd have $500 million that we'd have to make up in higher taxes. It was a very smart thing that they did. And since then, they've created more of these permanent funds. They're like college endowments, and they're designed for uh, thinking ahead for future generations and making sure that when oil and gas revenues, for example, are depleted, that the state doesn't go bankrupt. And so this was a very good thing. And fast forward to today, there's 11 of these permanent funds. And we looked at it and we were surprised that there's no permanent fund for healthcare, which is the second biggest cost to state government and also the fastest growing. And we thought this could be the solution to our low Medicaid reimbursement rates, is to create, and we proposed a $2 billion Medicaid trust fund using one-time monies like oil and gas. And George Munoz, the senator from Gallup, deserves all the credit here. And he got a bill through this last session, Senate Bill 88, that's funded mostly with oil and gas revenues. And he did some other clever things with money that doesn't revert and put it in there. And over 3 years, these funding sources are going to generate $511 million is the projection. I think there's going to be a special session where they're going to backfill it some more. And once it reaches $2 billion, they'll take 5% annually. So that would be $100 million. And then that can be matched federally. I think it's 3-1, or actually 72% federal, 28% New Mexico. So this is a great return on investment where you take $100 million and you get it matched by the federal government, approximately $300 million. Now you've got $400 million on an annual basis where you could raise Medicaid reimbursement rates across the board. That does two very important things. It keeps doctors here because they're not losing money now on all these procedures. And many doctors, not because they don't care, have stopped seeing Medicaid patients because they can't keep their doors open if they see a lot of Medicaid patients. So it makes healthcare more accessible. At the same time, it helps us to recruit and retain doctors. And Paul, I know because we've debated this privately and personally for a while now, feels differently about permanent funds. And he thinks that money, and it's a fair point, in a poor state should go back into the pockets of taxpayers. I would just make this case to Paul, which is these one-time surpluses that we have, it's like hitting the lottery. And if one of us, if Joaquin or Jim or Paul, if you won the lottery, would you spend it all, or might you set aside some for your retirement, for example? And that's really what we're proposing here. And now Paul's going to explain why I'm wrong.
Yeah, we've had a hold hands and sing kumbaya for the last half hour or so, but that ends at this moment. So yeah, I
Now the gloves
fundamentally
come off.
I do disagree with pretty much from the get go. First and foremost, uh, individuals and governments are two very different things in the way their finances should be approached. You and I, all of us, and all of the viewers and listeners, we live lives where we start out as children, and then we learn skills, we put those to work, we earn money, and then we inevitably pass into the great beyond. Uh, so we do need that retirement. A government can live forever, And a government also should not primarily be in business, if you will, for itself. It should be in business for the people that it serves and improving their lives. And I would say that if those permanent funds were so great, why is New Mexico perpetually at the bottom of all the good lists and the top of all the bad lists? I believe that the people of New Mexico have a right to that money. My preference is not to do what Alaska does with its permanent fund. I'm not saying that's not an option, but we should be in the process of eliminating our personal income tax, making our state much more attractive, reforming the gross receipts tax, which also would include medical expenditures, and really making New Mexico a competitive, successful state, because a lot of the conversation we're having right now is the direct result of New Mexico being an impoverished state, or at least the people of New Mexico being impoverished. But New Mexico's sitting overall, when you conclude all of the oil and gas funds and other permanent funds, we're at $64 billion. We grew that number by almost $1 billion a month this year alone. uh, None of that money is being returned to the taxpayers in any way, shape, or form. I mean, minimal amounts. It circles through and it becomes another government program. So, one of the fundamental problems that we have in the state that I think detracts from our quality of life is the low workforce participation rate. Not only does work give you meaning, it makes you more prosperous, your family more prosperous, and it's a lifestyle that results in self-fulfilling future generations improving their outcomes down the road as well. So uh, I think New Mexico needs to focus on getting people to work in high-paying jobs that don't require Medicaid and government welfare programs like that. Obviously, you're going to always have some number of folks who require assistance in healthcare, but we're the highest state in the country when it comes to Medicaid. So I think fundamentally we need to do our best to shift away from that, and you solve one of the bigger problems we're dealing with here. Uh, so permanent funds in general, I'm not excited about. SB 88, we did fight against it. I'm sad to say that not just Democrats, but pretty much Republicans across the board did support it. And I think, ultimately we should be focused much more on the causation and the fundamental problems that we face as a state and our people, not another way to fund Medicaid. So
And
that's
it's
my
fair.
soapbox.
Yeah, it's fair what you say. We are a state that's way too dependent on federal revenues, and our proposal would make us more dependent. But at the same time, Paul, the, the difference with this permanent fund than all the other permanent funds is the return on investment is incredible. I mean, Warren Buffett would be drooling where you set up a pot of money, in this case, $2 billion, that generates $100 million a year at a 5% draw, and then you get that matched 3 to 1. We're bringing $300 million into the state to fix a problem that we can't afford to fix. The only other way to fix it, Paul, would be something you would hate, which is raising taxes on New Mexicans by $300 million. So while you may not like our solution, it's better than the alternative. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I mean, obviously, this issue includes a lot of uh, what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. The big, beautiful bill, as Donald Trump called it, had an impact on Medicaid. If I was, so because this is a joint federal state program, I, if I had my preference, would be that Congress does block granting of Medicaid money and pushes the responsibility onto the states. One of the things that was discussed, and one of the reasons we came away with the big beautiful bill as it pertained to Medicaid, is because states like New Mexico were gaming the system and using things like provider taxes to access money through the Medicaid formula. and it resulted in money flowing disproportionately from the federal government to the state. So Medicaid, we could have a whole different conversation about ways to reform Medicaid. It's great that the state's getting so much of a return on its investment, but when it comes to improving medical outcomes, healthcare outcomes for people, Source New Mexico, and I believe this was based on an LFC, Legislative Finance Committee report, said that all the billions we've been throwing at healthcare in recent years hasn't actually moved the needle on outcomes. So I'm not convinced that Medicaid as a general program does a whole lot to improve healthcare outcomes. So maybe the state, maybe in the special session or the 30-day session that we're looking at moving forward, maybe that because of the reductions from the federal government, we might see some improvements in the way the Medicaid system works. I'm hopeful. I'm not necessarily banking on it, but I think the whole Medicaid system needs to be completely reformed, starting in Washington, D.C., and also at the state level. So
And Paul, this will surprise you. I agree that the way we've spent Medicaid dollars hasn't always been the most effective. But in this case, spending it on raising Medicaid reimbursement rates to make them more market competitive, again, does these two very important things that we desperately need. It gets doctors to see Medicaid patients, which makes healthcare more accessible, and it makes it easier to retain and recruit doctors.
that's
So,
fair. And they've done that in recent years in Santa Fe above and beyond SB 88. That has been a point
yeah.
using some of the oil and gas surplus that we have had to do that. So uh, I think there's a lot of issues with it long term, but anyway, yeah, it is something that can be done right now to solve this issue for sure.
Hey, let me jump in here and say thank you to Fred Nathan Jr. He is the founder of Think New Mexico. You can find out more detailed information about what Think New Mexico has put out in terms of policy, bringing back doctors and healthcare workers to New Mexico. You can go to thinknewmexico.org. Thank you to Paul Gessing, the president of the Rio Grande Foundation, riograndefoundation.org, and errorsoфenchantment.com for lots of details about this. And then we're going to follow up this interview with an interview specific to medical malpractice insurance premiums. And then we're going to have a third interview that's going to be talking about taxes on medical procedures, medical expenses, credentialing of doctors and healthcare workers, and educating doctors in New Mexico, because I know you both uh, think those are critical to bringing back doctors to New Mexico. Thank you both for joining today. You can find out more about this at their individual websites, thinknewmexico.org and riograndefoundation.org. And then go to newmexicosun.com, because we'll be converting these interviews into articles. Thank you all very much. Joaquin, thanks for getting us up today. And we'll talk to you next time on the New Mexico Suncast.